Sarah Williams had been practicing law for 15 years, but she had never seen a case quite like this one. The defendant sitting across from her in the cramped consultation room was not what most people would expect. Marcus Steele Rodriguez was a burly man with weathered hands and tattoos covering his arms, wearing the leather vest that marked him as a member of the notorious Hells Angels motorcycle club. The charges against him were serious: assault and battery stemming from a bar fight that had left another man hospitalized. The public defender's office was understaffed and overworked, as usual. Sarah had drawn the short straw and been assigned to represent Marcus, despite the whispers from her colleagues about taking on such a controversial client. The local media had already painted the case as another example of motorcycle gang violence, and the prosecution was pushing for the maximum sentence. Most lawyers would have advised a quick plea deal to minimize the damage, but Sarah believed in something more fundamental than public opinion. As she reviewed the police reports and witness statements, inconsistencies began to emerge. The supposed victim had a history of starting fights, and several witnesses mentioned that Marcus had actually been trying to break up the altercation, not start it. Security camera footage from the bar showed a different story than what the prosecution was claiming. During their first meeting, Marcus was suspicious and guarded. He had been through the legal system before and expected the worst. "Look, lady," he said in his gruff voice, "I know how this works. You do your job, I do my time, and we both move on." But Sarah looked him in the eye and said something that surprised him. "I believe you're innocent, and I'm going to prove it." The preparation for trial was intense. Sarah spent countless hours reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a defense strategy. She faced pressure from her supervisor to accept a plea bargain that would have sent Marcus to prison for 3 years. The local newspaper ran editorials questioning why taxpayer money was being spent on defending criminal bikers. Anonymous phone calls to her office suggested she should drop the case. Despite the mounting pressure, Sarah pressed forward. She discovered that the supposed victim had been drinking heavily that night and had initiated the confrontation after losing money in a poker game. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Marcus had actually stepped in to prevent the man from attacking a younger patron who couldn't defend himself. The hospital records showed injuries consistent with an accidental fall during the scuffle, not deliberate assault. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Members of the Hells Angels sat on one side, while the victim's family and supporters filled the other. The media presence was overwhelming, with cameras capturing every moment. Sarah knew that this case would define her career, but more importantly, it would determine whether an innocent man spent years behind bars. As she stood to deliver her opening statement, Sarah felt the weight of everyone's expectations. The prosecutor had painted Marcus as a dangerous criminal who represented everything wrong with motorcycle culture. Now it was her turn to show the jury who Marcus really was. Not a monster, but a man who had tried to do the right thing and found himself facing years in prison for his efforts. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Sarah was determined to fight with everything she had. The prosecution opened their case with dramatic flair, painting Marcus as a dangerous thug whose very presence had escalated a simple disagreement into violence. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh was known for her tough stance on organized crime, and she saw this case as an opportunity to send a message to motorcycle clubs throughout the state. She presented the victim, Tommy Brennan, as an innocent man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as Sarah began to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses, cracks in their story started to show. The first witness, a bartender named Jake, had initially told police that he hadn't seen how the fight started. Under oath, however, he claimed to have witnessed Marcus throw the first punch. Sarah pulled out his original statement, forcing him to admit that his memory had somehow become clearer over the months since the incident. The medical examiner's testimony proved particularly damaging to the prosecution's case. Dr. Patricia Chen had examined Tommy Brennan after the fight and documented his injuries. Under Sarah's careful questioning, she admitted that the pattern of bruising and the single head injury were more consistent with a fall than with repeated punches. The prosecution had claimed Marcus had beaten Brennan severely, but the medical evidence told a different story. Sarah's key breakthrough came when she called Maria Santos to the witness stand. Maria was a young waitress who had been working at the bar that night, but had been too frightened to come forward initially. She testified that Tommy Brennan had been drinking heavily and had become increasingly aggressive throughout the evening. According to Maria, Brennan had cornered a young man named Kevin near the pool table and was demanding money he claimed was owed to him from a card game. Maria's testimony revealed that Marcus had actually intervened when Brennan began shoving Kevin, who was clearly outmatched by the older, larger man. The biker guy told him to back off and leave the kid alone. Maria testified, her voice shaking slightly. Tommy got mad and swung at him, but he was so drunk he lost his balance. That's when he fell and hit his head on the corner of the pool table. The security footage, which the prosecution had initially claimed was too grainy to be useful, became Sarah's most powerful evidence. She had hired a video enhancement specialist who was able to clarify key moments of the altercation. The enhanced footage clearly showed Marcus stepping between Brennan and the younger man, then Brennan throwing a wild punch that caused him to stumble and fall. During Marcus's testimony, Sarah was able to show the jury a different side of the man they had been told to fear. Marcus spoke quietly but clearly about his military service, his work as a mechanic, and his involvement in charity rides that raised money for children's hospitals. He explained that the Hells Angels, despite their reputation, had a code that included protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The prosecutor's closing argument was passionate but ultimately unconvincing. She urged the jury to send a message about violence in their community, but couldn't overcome the medical evidence and video footage that contradicted her version of events. When Sarah stood for her closing statement, she reminded the jury that their job was not to judge Marcus based on his appearance or associations, but on the facts of what actually happened that night. After 3 days of testimony and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The foreman stood and announced not guilty on all charges. The relief in Marcus's eyes was immediate and profound. He had been facing 5 years in prison, and now he was free to return to his life. But what happened next would surprise everyone in that courtroom, including Sarah herself. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus approached Sarah with tears in his eyes. This tough man who had faced down years in prison was overcome with emotion. "You didn't just save me," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. "You saved my family. My daughter was supposed to graduate high school next month, and now I'll be there to see it." Sarah felt the satisfaction that comes with knowing justice had been served, but she had no idea that this moment was just the beginning. Word of the verdict spread quickly through the motorcycle community. Marcus wasn't just any member of the Hells Angels. He was a respected figure who had served as a mentor to younger riders and had organized numerous charity events. His arrest had sent shockwaves through the club, not just locally but across the entire network of chapters throughout the country. Members had been following the trial closely, many of them expecting the worst outcome despite believing in Marcus's innocence. 3 days after the trial ended, Sarah was working late at her office when her secretary knocked on her door. "Ms. Williams, there's someone here to see you," she said, looking puzzled. "Actually, there are several someones." Sarah walked to the front window of her office building and was shocked by what she saw. Nearly 50 motorcycles were parked outside, their chrome gleaming under the streetlights. Men and women in leather vests were standing quietly on the sidewalk, all of them wearing the distinctive patches of the Hells Angels. Marcus was among them, and he stepped forward as Sarah emerged from the building. "We wanted to thank you properly," he said simply. The group had traveled from 5 different states to be there. Some had driven for over 12 hours just to express their gratitude to the lawyer who had fought for one of their own when everyone else had written him off. The scene was surreal. Here was Sarah, a small African-American woman in a business suit surrounded by dozens of bikers who looked like they had stepped out of a movie. But there was nothing threatening about the moment. Instead, there was a profound sense of respect and appreciation. Many of the club members approached her individually to shake her hand and share their own stories of unfair treatment by the legal system. One older member named Frank told her about his son, who had been wrongfully convicted years earlier because he couldn't afford a good lawyer. Another woman named Lisa, one of the few female members present, spoke about how rare it was to find an attorney willing to see past stereotypes and fight for the truth. "You didn't just represent Marcus," she explained. "You represented all of us who have been judged before we even walked into a courtroom." The local media, which had covered the trial extensively, got wind of the gathering and arrived to document this unusual show of appreciation. The image of Sarah surrounded by grateful Hells Angels members made headlines across the region. Some people criticized her for associating with the motorcycle club, but many more were moved by the story of justice served and bridges built between unlikely allies. Sarah was invited to speak at the group's monthly meeting, something that had never happened with an outsider, let alone a lawyer. She learned about the club's extensive charity work, their support for veterans, and their tight-knit community that extended far beyond the stereotypes portrayed in movies and television. These were people with jobs, families, and deep loyalty to each other. The gathering outside her office lasted for over 2 hours. Members shared stories, took photographs, and presented Sarah with a custom leather jacket bearing an honorary patch. While she would never wear it to court, she understood the significance of the gesture. In their world, respect was earned, not given, and she had earned theirs through her dedication to Marcus's case. As the motorcycles finally roared to life and began to disperse into the night, Sarah realized that this experience had changed her as much as it had affected them. She had always believed in equal justice under the law, but now she had seen firsthand how that principle could bring together people from completely different worlds in mutual respect and understanding. The weeks following the courthouse gathering brought unexpected changes to Sarah's life and legal practice. Word had spread throughout the motorcycle community about the lawyer who had fought for Marcus against impossible odds, and soon she was receiving calls from bikers facing legal troubles across the region. Many of these cases involved the same kind of prejudice that Marcus had faced, assumptions made based on appearance rather than evidence. Sarah found herself representing a mechanic named Danny who had been wrongfully accused of selling stolen motorcycle parts simply because he worked on bikes and had tattoos. Another case involved a veteran named Robert who wore his club colors to a child custody hearing and was immediately labeled as an unfit father, despite having no criminal record and a stable job. Each case reinforced Sarah's belief that everyone deserved fair representation, regardless of how they looked or what group they belonged to. The Hells Angels began referring to Sarah as their go-to lawyer, but she was careful to maintain her professional standards. She made it clear that she would only take cases where she believed the client was innocent or had been treated unfairly. She would not provide legal cover for actual criminal activity, and the club members respected her boundaries. This mutual respect created a unique relationship that benefited everyone involved. One of the most meaningful developments was Sarah's involvement in the club's charity work. She learned that the Hells Angels organized toy drives for underprivileged children, raised money for veterans organizations, and participated in fundraising rides for various causes. When they invited her to speak at a fundraising event for a children's hospital, she discovered a side of the motorcycle community that rarely made headlines. At the charity event, Sarah was amazed to see hundreds of bikers gathered to support sick children. They had raised over $50,000 through bike shows, raffles, and donations. The event featured a motorcycle parade that brought joy to young patients who watched from hospital windows. Sarah realized that the same loyalty and brotherhood that made people fear this group also motivated them to help those in need. The relationship also opened Sarah's eyes to the challenges faced by people who didn't fit society's expectations of respectability. She began taking on more cases involving individuals who were judged by their appearance rather than their actions. A young man with facial piercings who was denied a job despite his qualifications, a woman with visible tattoos who was discriminated against in family court, and an elderly man who was profiled by police simply for riding a motorcycle. Sarah's work with the motorcycle community led to speaking engagements at law schools and legal conferences. She spoke about the importance of looking beyond stereotypes and the danger of allowing prejudice to influence the legal system. Her presentations challenged other lawyers to examine their own biases and consider whether they were truly providing equal representation to all clients. The local bar association initially had mixed reactions to Sarah's new clientele. Some colleagues worried about the reputation of lawyers who represented motorcycle clubs, while others admired her commitment to equal justice. Eventually, her success in these cases and her professional conduct won over most skeptics. She received an award from the State Bar Association for her work in civil rights and equal representation. Marcus became a close friend and unofficial consultant, helping Sarah understand motorcycle culture, and the challenges faced by club members in their interactions with law enforcement. He also served as a character witness in several cases, his articulate testimony helping to dispel stereotypes about bikers. His own transformation from defendant to advocate showed how the legal system could work when lawyers were willing to fight for the truth. The collaboration between Sarah and the Hells Angels also led to improved relationships between the club and local law enforcement. When misunderstandings arose, Sarah was often called in to mediate, helping both sides communicate more effectively. Police officers began to recognize that not all bikers were criminals, and club members learned to work within the system rather than against it. This period of bridge building culminated in an unprecedented event that would bring national attention to their unlikely partnership and challenge assumptions about justice, prejudice, and the power of standing up for what's right. 6 months after Marcus's trial, Sarah received a call that would test everything she had learned about courage and community support. A young African-American teenager named Jerome Washington had been arrested for a crime he didn't commit. The evidence against him was weak, built primarily on the testimony of a single witness who had identified him in a questionable lineup. Jerome's family couldn't afford a private attorney, and the overworked public defender assigned to his case was pushing for a plea deal. Jerome's grandmother, Mrs. Ella Washington, had heard about Sarah's reputation for fighting impossible cases. When she called Sarah's office, she was desperate. "My grandson is a good boy," she pleaded. "He was at home studying when they say this happened. But nobody wants to listen to us." Sarah agreed to meet with Jerome and his family, and what she discovered made her blood boil. The case involved a convenience store robbery where the clerk had been assaulted. The actual crime had been committed by someone matching Jerome's general description, a young black male of average height. But the investigation had been sloppy, the lineup procedure was flawed, and crucial security camera footage had been mysteriously damaged. It was a textbook example of how racial bias could corrupt the justice system. Sarah knew this case would be even more challenging than Marcus's trial. She would be fighting not just prosecutorial misconduct, but systemic racism that made it easier to convict a young black man than to conduct a thorough investigation. The family had limited resources, and the case would require extensive investigation and expert witnesses they couldn't afford. When Sarah mentioned Jerome's situation to Marcus during one of their regular conversations, his response surprised her. "What do you need?" he asked simply. When she explained the financial challenges and the need for investigators to track down the real perpetrator, Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Give me a day," he said. The next evening, Marcus called Sarah with an extraordinary proposal. The Hells Angels wanted to fund Jerome's defense. Not just the local chapter, but multiple chapters across 3 states had voted to contribute to a legal defense fund. They had raised $30,000 in just 24 hours, with more coming in daily. "You fought for one of ours when nobody else would," Marcus explained. "Now we want to fight for one of yours." The news that a motorcycle club was funding the defense of a black teenager made national headlines. Critics accused the Hells Angels of seeking publicity, while supporters praised their commitment to justice. Sarah found herself fielding calls from news programs and newspapers, all wanting to understand this unlikely alliance. The defense fund allowed Sarah to hire the best investigators and expert witnesses available. They tracked down the real perpetrator, a man with a lengthy criminal record who had been overlooked by police because he didn't match their assumptions about the crime. Security footage from a nearby business, which police had failed to check, clearly showed Jerome was nowhere near the scene when the robbery occurred. The trial became a media sensation, not just because of the evidence of Jerome's innocence, but because of the diverse group of supporters who filled the courtroom each day. Hells Angels members sat alongside church congregations, civil rights activists, and community leaders. The image of leather-clad bikers holding hands with elderly black grandmothers during prayer circles outside the courthouse became an iconic symbol of unity across racial and cultural lines. Sarah's closing argument was passionate and precise. She methodically dismantled the prosecution's case while highlighting the real evidence of Jerome's innocence. But more importantly, she spoke about the courage it took for people to step outside their comfort zones and support justice, regardless of whether the defendant looked like them or came from their community. When the jury returned with a not guilty verdict after just 2 hours of deliberation, The courtroom erupted in celebration. Jerome collapsed into his grandmother's arms while Hell's Angels members cheered alongside civil rights activists. The prosecutor, faced with overwhelming evidence of the police investigation's failures, announced that charges would be filed against the actual perpetrator the following week. Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Washington approached the group of Hell's Angels who had attended every day of the trial. With tears streaming down her face, she embraced Marcus and thanked him for believing in her grandson. "You didn't have to help us," she said, "but you did it anyway, and that means everything." The image of that embrace, captured by dozens of photographers, appeared on front pages across the country. It showed that justice and human decency could transcend the barriers that usually divided communities. The Hell's Angels had proven that their loyalty and brotherhood extended beyond their own members to anyone fighting for what was right. 2 years after Jerome Washington walked free from that courtroom, Sarah Williams reflected on how dramatically her life and career had changed. Her law practice had evolved into something she never could have imagined: a firm that specialized in fighting for the underrepresented, funded partly by an ongoing partnership with motorcycle clubs across the region. The Hells Angels had established a permanent legal defense fund, contributing a percentage of their charity ride proceeds to help people who couldn't afford quality representation. The success of Jerome's case had created a ripple effect throughout the legal community. Other lawyers began taking on cases they might have previously avoided, inspired by Sarah's example of looking beyond stereotypes to find the truth. Law schools started inviting Sarah to speak about unconscious bias in the legal system, and her story became a case study in criminal justice reform programs. Marcus had become more than a client or even a friend. He was a partner in building bridges between communities that had historically viewed each other with suspicion. Together, they founded a nonprofit organization called Justice Without Judgment, which provided legal assistance and advocacy training to marginalized communities. The organization taught people how to navigate the legal system and connected them with attorneys willing to take on challenging cases. The Hells Angels, chapters that had supported Jerome's defense, continued their involvement in civil rights causes. They began attending community meetings, participating in neighborhood watch programs, and volunteering for legal aid clinics. Their presence initially made some community members uncomfortable, but over time, people began to see past the leather and tattoos to appreciate their genuine commitment to helping others. Sarah's reputation had spread far beyond her original community. She received cases from across the country, often involving people who had been written off by the legal system because of their appearance, background, or associations. A transgender woman facing discrimination in family court, an immigrant worker wrongfully accused of theft, a homeless veteran charged with crimes he didn't commit, all found their way to Sarah's door, often referred by the growing network of people who believed everyone deserved a fighting chance. The relationship between Sarah and the motorcycle community had also changed law enforcement practices in the region. Police departments began implementing bias training and reviewing their procedures for investigating crimes involving motorcycles or motorcycle clubs. The number of wrongful arrests declined significantly, and when disputes did arise, mediation became the preferred first step rather than automatic prosecution. Jerome Washington had thrived since his acquittal. He graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to study criminal justice at the State University. His goal was to become a lawyer himself, inspired by Sarah's example and determined to help others who found themselves caught in a system that sometimes valued assumptions over evidence. He remained in close contact with both Sarah and Marcus, considering them family. Mrs. Washington had become an unlikely spokesperson for criminal justice reform, speaking at churches and community centers about the importance of supporting the wrongfully accused, regardless of their background. Her friendship with members of the Hells Angels had challenged stereotypes in her own community, showing that allies could come from the most unexpected places. The annual charity ride organized by the Hells Angels had grown into one of the largest fundraising events in the state. The event now attracted participants from all walks of life. Lawyers, teachers, police officers, and community leaders joined the bikers for a ride that raised money for legal defense funds, children's charities, and veterans organizations. Sarah always participated, riding behind Marcus on his Harley-Davidson, a sight that still drew amazed stares but had become a symbol of unity and justice. The story of how a black woman defended a Hell's Angel and changed both their communities had been featured in national magazines, documentary films, and academic studies. But for Sarah, the real measure of success wasn't the media attention or professional recognition. It was the phone calls from people who had found hope when everything seemed hopeless. The thank you letters from families whose loved ones had received fair treatment, and the knowledge that she had helped prove that justice truly could be blind to everything except the truth. As she sat in her office one evening, looking at the framed photograph of Jerome's acquittal celebration, Sarah smiled at how much her world had expanded. She had started her career wanting to practice law, but she had ended up changing lives and challenging a system that too often failed the people who needed it most. The Hells Angels jacket hanging in her closet remained unworn but treasured, a reminder that courage and conviction could create the most powerful and unexpected alliances.